Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, January 7th, 2010. Or is it 2010? I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine, joins us to talk about foam. Where does it come from, and what are the factors that promote it and destroy it? Also, we check in with an update of the latest BYO-BBR Collaborative Experiment. Well, if you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james, and you can find our show at facebook.com/basicbrewing. And if you become a fan of the show there, I'll send out little updates when shows are posted. Well, thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show, and we appreciate your support greatly. We also have associate links on our site for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association, too. Hope you're having a happy MMX. That's this year in Roman numerals. If you want to stay above the fray in the 2010 versus 2010 debate, MMX, a lot quicker to say. Let's jump into the mailbag for a little bit for the first time this year. Chris from Fairfield, Connecticut writes in. He says, I was listening to your 1217 podcast and the email you read regarding a listener's peanut butter cup stout and the oily mouthfeel. Chris says, I'd been asked by a friend to brew a batch of peanut butter beer, and I was doing some research and thought about the same issue of the oil. After some thought and some input from Tess and Mark Samatulski, they are my local homebrew shop owners, lucky me, says Chris, and I agree. Chris says there's a bit of a solution to some of the oil issue. It takes some time, but using natural peanut butter for the recipe is the first thing, in that there are no added oils in the natural peanut butter. Also, to reduce the amount of oil, dry the peanut butter out, spreading out the peanut butter on a stack of paper towels, changing them every day or so to extract as much of the oil as you can. Continue to do this for a period of a few weeks until the peanut butter has more of a powdered, drier feel to the touch. Chris says you'll still have some oil forming at the top of your fermenter, but do your best to stay away from that when the beer is racked. This should help reduce or eliminate the oil concerns. Well, thanks, Chris. Interesting. Sounds like a lot of work. But it sounds like a solution if you're wanting to keep the oil out of your beer in the first place. I think I'd like to taste a peanut butter beer first to see if it were worth all the trouble. But thanks, Chris, for sending that in, and thanks indirectly to Mark and Tess for the advice. Skylar from Wasilla, Alaska writes, my family has a history of making interesting fermented beverages, excluding beer and mead, but including things like dandelion wines, rhubarb wine, and various berry wines. So from a young age, I was lucky enough to see the fermentation process in action and taste some interesting concoctions. In researching the topic, I've come up with some interesting ideas about fermenting unusual plants, and I'm curious if anyone has tried making a wine with them before. The plants I'm most curious about, says Skylar, are fungi, are mushrooms. Would it be possible to make a mushroom wine? Do they have enough sugars to support fermentation? Will yeast even consider preying on their long-lost cousins? Little fungus cannibalism there. Well, that's a good question. Skylar, I did a Google search, as I'm sure you did as well, and I didn't find much on the topic of mushroom beers or mushroom wines. Some pages or entries were talking about adding mushrooms to beers as a flavoring or an adjunct, but there was nothing that I found on whether there was enough sugar in the mushrooms to support fermentation by themselves. So what do you think, listeners out there? Do you have any personal experience? Have you brewed a mushroom beer or a mushroom wine? Or do you know of anybody who has? Drop me a line and let me know. You can find me at james@basicbrewing.com or just use the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Finally, Chris down in Newcastle, Australia, sent me a link to a couple of YouTube videos of his making candy sugar with the recipes and techniques he downloaded from our site. You may remember the episode from May of this past year when Joshua Smith gave us tips on playing with caramelizing sugar for brewing purposes. Chris shot a very nice video with some mesmerizing music of his stovetop and the sugar boiling thereon. And his sugar appears to have turned out better than the match that Steve and I did on the video podcast. So I posted Chris's video on our Facebook page at facebook.com/basicbrewing if you want to take a look. And thanks to Chris from Newcastle for sending that on. And now we move on to another Chris. We move on to our discussion with Chris Colby on beer foam and our current collaborative experiment. Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks, James. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. You're back home after a trip up north.
Yep, went up north, drank some Scandinavian beers, came back home.
Cool. That's that's the view from 30,000 feet of your trip.
Yeah, I also got to meet with the local homebrew club up there, the Big Sioux Brewing Society. It was a good time. Excellent.
Well, I guess before we get into the discussion on foam, we should kind of update everybody on the experiment, which I forgot to mention last week, unfortunately. I guess my head was still full of cobwebs from holiday time. But I have already brewed my experiment, and I've bottled 2/3 of it. I have bottled the full volume boil and the partial volume boil, and today I'm going to bottle the partial volume boil with the extract added late, or half the extract added late. And I have decided to go, your recipe called for a partial mash, and we talked about this before I brewed it, and I decided that if I was going to have any chance of doing all 3 portions of it, that I was going to have to skip the partial mash portion and just do an all extract, and that's what I've done.
Sure.
And I've gotten some emails from brewers out there who are wanting to participate, so I think we'll have good participation this time. Well, any participation is good participation as far as I'm concerned. But a question that has arisen more than once is...
Arisen?
I was just going to gloss right over that.
That's awesome.
Darn Skype and its audio quality. A question that has come up more than once is, I only have time to do 2 of the 3 portions of the experiment. Which 2 should I choose? Should I do the full wort boil versus partial volume boil, or should I do the all extract added at the beginning of the boil versus the, part of the extract added at the end of the boil? So what's your preference? What's your take on that?
Well, there's questions to be answered in any pair. As we were talking about before the show, we sort of envisioned the experiment as full wort boil versus a partial. And so anyone just wanting to do 2 batches could certainly do a full wort boil versus a partial in either the straight up, old school form where you add all your extract first, or with an extract late. But if you didn't have the ability to do a full wort boil, certainly doing a full wort, by the, conventional method, and a partial boil by the normal method, and a partial boil with extract late, that also has some interesting questions, because people say there's differences in extract, hop extract, and by people I mean me. I've said that in print. So there's a question that can be put to the test there. So really any of the pairs would help, but we're really, I think sort of hoping that we get more people doing if they're going to do two, doing the full boil versus one of the partial boils. But certainly, if we would rather have someone participate than drop out because they couldn't do a full wort boil.
Right. And again, another option is to do a full wort boil, but do half the volume, which is what I did. I did 3 2.5-gallon batches. So I did that was able to do that in a 5-gallon pot on the stove, inside, out of the cold, without any problem. So what I did was I actually did a 2.5-gallon, or I actually started the boil with 3 gallons on the full wort boil, and then 1.5 gallons on the partial volume boil, and then just topped it off with water in the fermenter. So that's another option that you can do as well.
Yeah, I'm doing all mine as 2.5-gallon batches.
Plus, your recipe is expensive.
Is it? Why is it expensive?
Well, there's especially
the hops.
The hops, and especially since I didn't do the partial mash, so it's all extract for me. So that was like 12 pounds of extract, and then a gob of hops, which is going to be real tasty beer. But I think I figured out the cost per 6-pack is going to be like $10.
Wow.
A 6-pack, which is not bad for a good beer. It's about what I pay for craft beer here in Northwest Arkansas. So I'm not complaining too much, but I'm glad I didn't do 3 5-gallon batches. And again, you don't have to stick with Chris's recipe if you want to do the experiment. You can do whatever recipe you want to do. It's just that
you can do a Pliny the Elder clone, which will cost you twice as much.
Or you could do a porter, or you could do whatever. Sure. It's all up to you, and we're looking forward to the data. And I'll try to get off my hinder this week and get the form out there. People have been asking, where's the form? So in the meantime, take really good notes on your gravities and your process, and notes on fermentation, and tasting notes, and visual notes, and whatever you can think of, so that when I finally do get off my keister and get that out there, you can just fill it right in.
Yeah, the information we're looking for also is written out in my blog at BYO.com.
Yeah, good point. Anything else on the experiment before we move on to foam?
Not too much. I'm hoping to brew all my beers this weekend and early next week, and then sort of pitch enough yeast so that they ferment quickly, which we learned from the last experiment actually works. Yeah. Speeding up fermentation, and get a good quick ferment, get them kegged, get them bottled,
and send them off to Brad.
Send them off to Brad.
Brad Sturgeon, who is going to help us with the analytics, which I'm excited about.
Check out the big brain on Brad.
He's also got big machines, apparently. So
big machines are good.
So our discussion this week is centered on an article by Chris Bible in the January-February issue of Brew Your Own magazine, called Foam Factors, the Formation and Stability of Beer Foam. And I got as I knocked the recorder off the counter, I got an email from John, and I'm not sure where John's from, but he had a letter that goes along with this, and I thought I would share that and kind of give us a springboard into the conversation. John says, I have a question about the chemistry of the strength of the foam of a beer that I'm trying to replicate, but have not yet perfectly recreated. What happened is I made an oatmeal porter that had a head on it that was so thick that I could balance a knife in the beer without it touching the sides of the glass. It was a neat trick. The only problem is that subsequent attempts have not had such a strong head on them. The beer itself was creamy but not abnormal in any other way except that the head had very dense bubbles. Do you have any ideas for me to recreate it, or do I have to just keep trying until I recreate the accident? Someone suggested that it happened from overcooking the Scottish oats till they created a gelatin of sorts. Is this possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, strictly, can overcooking oats create gelatin? The answer is no, because gelatin's made from collagen, which is an animal product. But colloquially, people talk about in cooking and brewing, any sort of heating up starch can make gels that they sort of colloquially call gelatinization. And I guess that's possible. I mean, I would say that without more information, it's really hard to tell. You know, in a one-off sort of situation where something happened once, it's really hard to tell. You've got an oatmeal porter. So two guesses of why the foam is really good was, one was there's a lot of dark malts, which tend to make a nice foam. Two, there's oatmeal in there, which tends to make a nice foam. And if you're trying to replicate it, what I'd do is go back and look at your notes from brewing, and probably especially the handling of the oatmeal. That would be my guess. And then as for the the nitty gritty chemistry of why the foam was that way, that's a little bit beyond what I would want to just speculate on at this point.
But what we can do is take a look into Chris's article and talk about the factors that affect foam, both positively and negatively. And maybe there's some clues in there that John can pick up on to say, aha, that's what I did, or that's the process, or at least part of the process that he may want to look at.
Sure.
So when we're talking about foam on top of the beer, what are we talking about? Where does it come from? What creates it? And why is it good or bad?
Yeah, foam is just, like in general, foam is just a lot of bubbles in a little bit of solid matter. Usually a liquid, but doesn't have to be. In beer, foam is created because, either at the end of the fermentation, you cap the tank to preserve some CO2, or, as in bottle conditioning, or you add CO2 pressure to the top of a vessel storing beer. And in either case, carbon dioxide inside the container is dissolved into the beer, and given that the pressure in the vessel is higher than outside, the beer contains more carbon dioxide in it than it could at a lower pressure. And additionally, beer is usually stored cold, so it stores more, or more CO2 is dissolved or actually less CO2 is dissolved at colder temperatures. Is that right?
Well, I think more.
I got wound up and I don't know where I was going.
A colder liquid can hold more CO2, right?
That's right. Yeah, gases dissolve more thoroughly into cold liquids. That's right. Okay. Yeah, so you've got more CO2 dissolved in a cold beer under pressure than you would at a slightly warmer beer at standard pressure, at the pressure of the atmosphere wherever you are. So when you open a beer, the conditions in the liquid go from having enough pressure to you can think about it as enough pressure to push some CO2 into the beer to suddenly that pressure not being there, and so CO2 starts to bubble out of solution. And as it bubbles out of solution, it picks up different molecules, proteins, and carbohydrates. These coat the bubbles, and then it when it erupts at the top of at the level of the liquid, it's coated with all that, and it drags them up. And then a layer of bubbles forms below that, and then below that, and just pushes up a column of foam.
Now, I put out the question on Twitter. I said that I was going to be talking to you about this and solicited questions, and I got some good ones. BBJ712 says, how important is it, foam that is, for the home brewer who's just enjoying their creation? What does it matter?
That's a good question. I would say that, part of it is just a preference. Some people like a lot of foam on their beers, some don't. I happen to like, a lot of foam or whatever. But beyond that, I think the reason a lot of people like to see foam in a beer is that foam, a good foam stand in a beer is generally indicative of good brewing practices. If you've done everything right in a beer, foam just sort of magically appears and clings and stays around for a while. And so I think, there are properties to foam that people say, are good for beer, and then it traps aromas and it, does all this. But to me, and this is just an opinion, not a fact, but to me, I think the primary reason that foam is important is that it is sort of a side effect or an indicator that your brewing has gone correctly.
So if you pour a nice pint of ale and it's flat, there's no foam on top, it's certainly not as visually appealing, right?
Right, and I would further say that it's indicative that something has gone wrong, or at least something has gone not as well as it could have in the brewing process. And from there, it could be something as simple as lack of carbonation. I mean, a lot of people follow the sort of old rule of using 3/4 of a cup of corn sugar per 5-gallon batch as like no matter what beer they are doing, that's how much corn sugar they use, and that will give you that gives you sort of a low level of carbonation that's nice in sort of English bitters, session beer, specifically English session beers. But a lot of the beers that we drink as Americans are more highly carbonated, and I think a lot of homebrew gets undercarbonated. That, and couple that with if you don't stir the bottling sugar in, you get some bottles are even less carbonated than others. And the other big head killer, I think, is overly hot fermentations. Either pitching too little and having the fermentation be sluggish for a while and then spike all of a sudden, or just running the fermentation too hot, and that gives higher alcohols and some yeast byproducts that are actually foam negative.
Now you were talking about it. You referred to American beers. Ben VH says, "Why do most American craft brews have pretty much no head, at least compared to my European travels of more than 10 years ago?" Now that's an interesting question, and maybe too sweeping and wide of a generalization. Why do American craft beers have less foam than their European counterparts?
I don't know, and I certainly, from anecdotal evidence of simply drinking a lot of beer, I don't really see that there's a huge difference in there. In comparing beers that he drinks now versus beers that he drank in the past over in Europe, I guess there's a lot of potential for some confounding factors there. One thing, if he's doing something in his house, like using a detergent on his glasses that has some foam negative characteristics, he might just be killing all the heads. Whereas when he was over in Europe trying beers, maybe, they all served it in nice glassware. Also, there's always a possible when you compare something from the present with your memory of the past that your memory is wrong. I mean, before I worked on an answer of why American beers have less head, I would sort of want it proven that American beers actually do have less head, and I don't know. It could also be beer styles. I mean, if you were drinking, Hefeweizens over there, or even a lot of Pilsners, which they tend to have the big foamy heads on, and are drinking different styles of beer over here, maybe, especially higher gravity beers, which tend to have a lower amount of head, lower amount of foam. That could be it too.
And also, there's some factors that we'll talk about here in a second. It could be the shape of the glass that he's using. The fatter, wider American, style shaker / pint glass versus a taller, say, European Pilsner glass, and the temperature. Maybe the beers that he's drinking here in the United States are colder than the beers that he drank 10 years ago in Europe. I don't know. It's just speculation.
Or the way the bartender poured it in Europe.
Yeah.
A lot of those beers have a big, they have the fill mark and then the room for a lot of foam, and, there's, especially with wheat beers, there's like ways to pour it that generate a lot of foam.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but I don't know if I think it needs an answer, if that makes sense.
Well, let's go over some of the factors that affect foam both positively and negatively. And Chris has done a great job of Chris Bible has done a great job of laying out these two tables, organizing them. Factor number one, in the positive category, highly kilned malt. Why would highly kilned malt be effective?
Well, there's, I don't know, a number of reasons. Probably the biggest is that there are sort of Maillard products or melanoidins that are produced during kilning that have an effect on foam. Also, if you look down at the bottom of the chart, lower beer pH is foam positive too, and more highly kilned malts tend to drive the pH of a beer lower. So I actually don't know if the highly kilned malt has an effect, up and above the pH, but it apparently has to do with the presence of melanoidins.
High beer viscosity, which makes sense, or a high final gravity in the beer has a positive effect.
Yeah, that one's kind of easy because, beer foam is made out of sort of, if you want to think about it, the solids dissolved in beer. It's carbohydrates mostly and proteins, which seem to be the key sort of locking mechanisms to keep it foamy. So, just the more stuff is in your beer, the better your foam is going to be. Although obviously as gravity increases, other factors start to impact it.
Mm-hmm. A high hop rate or post-fermentation hopping. More hops, more foam.
Yeah, interesting. Iso-alpha acids, the component of hops that that emerge during the boil from iso acids or from alpha acids. Those also, not only do they bitter beer, but they help stabilize foam, which is one reason why if you taste, you've got a hoppy beer, you pour it and you taste just the foam, that's sort of, if anything, more intensely bitter than the beer.
That's true. The presence of certain metals in the beer.
Yeah. Let me actually look at, I'm not sure if I know why that is. Oh, it says here they help cross-link alpha acids. Okay, sure. They help cross-link iso-alpha acids, James. I don't know why you didn't know that.
Well, I knew. I was just testing you.
Thought that was common knowledge. Really.
As we talked about before, low beer temperature.
Yeah. Here it says a couple different things. It lowers beer viscosity, and secondarily, of course, as we talked about, low beer temperature helps dissolve more CO2 into the beer.
Yeah, if you think about it, if you open a hot can of Coca-Cola, it's more likely to spew than if you were to cool it down. So
right, and I think also just the creation of foam is going to happen with the bubbles, but the collapse of it, is simply a physical process. You've got, all the films around the different bubbles, and they're just draining, and it's just a simple physical chemical process. And if it's colder, that's just going to go more slowly.
The use of tall, narrow glasses.
Yeah, this one's pretty easy to explain. You just, in a tall, narrow glass, you've got, sort of a taller amount of foam compared to if you poured in the same amount of beer in a wide glass. And so all the CO2 just rises up in a narrower area and, just piles up on top of each other or, below. The new layers of foam pile up below the existing layers of foam and just push it higher. Whereas if you got a wider, broader glass, there's less, sort of less beer depth below any point of foam, so you've got less, new bubbles pushing up below the older bubbles.
There's a higher ratio of surface area to the beer, essentially.
Yeah, in the wide glass.
The use of a yeast strain that produces fewer fusel oils.
Yeah, fusel oils are another name for higher alcohols. ethanol, the main alcohol in beer has 2 carbons to it. Methanol has 1, which beer strains shouldn't be producing to any appreciable measure. But in a stressed fermentation, especially high temperatures, alcohols of a higher number of carbons, 3 or 4, can be produced, and these are just foam negative. They just disrupt the bubbles. So if you're picking a strain that produces a lot of these, which certain English strains do, if you're using the English strain of yeast that produces sort of a very characterful aroma, fusel oils might be one of those components, and certainly if your beers always smell a little bit nail polishy or solventy, that's an indication that that your yeast might be producing a lot of those, and that could either be the yeast strain choice or you're fermenting at too high of a temperature.
Small bubble size. How do you get small bubbles?
Longer conditioning time, basically. As beer just sits in conditions, it's gonna the bubble size is just going to decrease. If you, for example, let's say you take a keg of beer that's cold but flat, and you do the forced carbonation shaking method, and shake it up for 20 minutes or whatever, and then serve it 3 hours later, you're going to get fairly big bubbles because the CO2 hasn't really sort of, I don't know the exact nitty gritty molecular what's going on there, but it just in practice does produce coarser bubbles. Whereas if you've let it sit for longer, it tends to produce smaller ones.
And that goes along with Adam's question. Adam from Davenport, Iowa. He asks, does age affect foam? He's noticed some of his beers that are more than a year old have better foam than what he remembers when they were young. So they've had longer time to condition and longer time to get good and carbonated, I guess.
I think that may be part of it. There's one, the small bubble thing we just talked about, but 2, it may be just beers take a little while to condition in a bottle, and depending on where you store them, if you live down here in Texas and bottle conditioning means 75 to 80 degrees, your beers are going to condition quickly. But if you live up in Minnesota in the winter and you store your bottles downstairs, and they're conditioning at 50, that might take I don't know how long because I don't live there, but longer. So it may be that you were when your beers were young, you were tasting them, and there was still a little bit of either, probably not the fermentation left over, but there's probably still a lot of gas in the headspace that hadn't completely soaked into the beer.
The use of isinglass, which is fish bladder, right?
Mm-hmm. I guess in this case, it's just a straight up case of whatever's in isinglass. The finding material has foam positive polypeptides in it. And
you would for the newbies, you would use that to
cleanse
help
out yeast.
Yeah, to help clarify your beer. Carbonating with a nitrogen/CO2 mixture.
Right, to get the Guinness head or whatever. The short answer here is that nitrogen is less soluble by a good deal than carbon dioxide. And when it's properly mixed, you get really, really small bubbles from the nitrogen, and that helps a lot to make a big, nice foamy head.
Now we switch from the factors that are positive to the factors that are negative. Over modified malt.
Over modified malt, yeah. Modification in malt is just sort of the degree that they've let the kernel germinate and grow before they stop it in the malting process by drying it and kilning it. And the farther you get into over modification, the sort of lower the amount of proteins you have in the malt. And given that their proteins are, or at least there's a set of proteins that are foam positive, the more you modify your malt, the less those proteins are present.
Excessive boiling of the wort. especially for all grain brewers, I would assume.
Yeah, basically, again, proteins are foam positive, and with excessive boiling, you can just break them down. So it's just a simple case of an excessive boiling of the wort is going to give you, is just going to degrade some of the foam positive proteins. And of course, you have to balance that with the fact that you need a good boil to do, to accomplish a lot of other things in the beer. And also, one thing when you're looking at, foam positive and foam negative things, you also have to consider the degree to which these occur. Mm. And one thing I would say with excessive boiling of wort, there are a lot of beers that are boiled like 2 hours and still have foam that's fine, a good, it might have been slightly bigger if you'd only been boiled for 60 minutes, but, you have to think about the degree to which these affect it. And, in this list, it just gives, yes or no. And,
it's a balancing act.
Yeah. It would be, in a lot of these, it would be sort of hard to, you'd have to have some measure of foam stability, and report it in, the numbers and the units, and there's a million confounding factors. So, at least I've never seen any sort of presentation that explained, this many units of, over modified malt leads to this many, kilofoams of, yeah, you'd have to do a lot of science to get to a mathematical, model that described doing this leads to, this impact on your foam.
Mm-hmm. The use of old hops is negative for foam.
Yeah, this is just in the positive category. The reason that hops increased foam was that they added iso-alpha acids, which are foam positive, and the more you store hops, the longer you store them, the alpha acid content goes down. So when you boil them, you get less iso-alpha acids out of them.
And we've addressed this a bit. Detergent or soap residue in beer glasses or lipids in beer or glasses. In other words, if you have a dirty beer glass with some lipstick on the side and the beer touches that, it might have an impact.
Yeah, just anything, any sort of fatty substance that is foam negative, if that touches beer, your foam's going to go away, sometimes very quickly. And actually, it's weird, the detergent that you wash your glasses in can have an effect, and that's one reason why a lot of homebrewers who are really sort of, really enjoy good foam on their beer make sure to hand wash their glasses. They don't just do it in the dishwasher, mm-hmm. and do an extra good rinse at the end with hot water.
Especially with a rinse aid in your dishwasher.
Yeah, like was it Cascade or whatever? Some of those things can. I don't know if that one in particular, but some of those can be foam killers.
High beer temperature. So if you have a warm beer, more foam will come out. But if it's too high, that's negative for the stability.
Right, and this is again just the straight chemistry of chemistry and physics of things happen more quickly at higher temperatures. The foam collapses faster at higher temperatures because the films surrounding the bubbles, the liquid films, just drain faster.
Contact of beer with autolyzing yeast.
Yeah, yeast when it dies, releases its contents, a part of which are lipids and other fatty molecules, and so these in addition to imparting an unpleasant off flavor when it does happen, although in our previous experiment we showed that it takes longer than people thought.
I was wondering how you were going to balance that in.
Yeah, and so it's just the yeast just release things that are foam negative, and that's one interesting thing when you think about getting back to the question from Twitter previously of the guy whose foam got better with time. You would think, at least in a bottle conditioned beer, this, if you're thinking solely about the autolyzing yeast, you'd think that your foam would get worse. But you've got the confounding factor of the, as it conditions, it's going to have smaller bubbles, and that's going to be a positive factor. So it's important to think of, your foam. If you're working on getting better foam, and especially if you don't have any, you don't necessarily need to hit everything on this list.
Mm-hmm.
You just, there's probably one thing that's killing your foam, not many things. And certainly, some of these things like foam for foam improvement, highly kiln malt. Well, if you want to brew a pale beer, you can't really use highly kiln malt, although you can use, a tiny amount of it that only, moves the color a little bit, but then you would expect that would only have a small impact on the foam as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, the great thing about lists like this is if you're, if you've been brewing beer and you're really disappointed with the quality of the foam, hopefully you can look down the list and see something that sticks out, that indicates to you, here's the problem in my brewing.
And in the article itself, Chris goes in with a little bit more finesse than just a list in talking about how these factors interact with one another. Going along with you're talking about ingredients there. Tangent from down in Adelaide asks, why does a handful of carapils in a lager make it so foamy with a good lace?
That's another good question. Carapils is a dextrin malt, and a lot of different companies make it. Breese makes a Carapils. Wireman does. They also make one that's called Carafoam, specifically for foam. And these are kind of crystal malt, sometimes called a dextrin malt. And I don't really know the nitty gritty, but basically they're malted in a way that provides more foam positive molecules for the beer. I mean, and I realize that explanation really doesn't add anything beyond Carapils makes good foam, but
it's magic.
Yeah, it's magic. But if they do something, and I mean, a likely guess would be something that either supplies more of the carbohydrates or proteins that end up in the foam than other malts. But beyond that, I really don't know the nitty gritty. On their website, Breese claims that their process in making their Carapils is proprietary, so they're not giving out that information. And I haven't, in the professional brewing books I've looked at, the only thing they really mention about Carapils is that it's sort of a lightly kilned caramel malt. So at least for me, it's a good question. Maybe someone out there has more knowledge on that particular brewing ingredient.
Now, I found out that whenever I add wheat to a beer, whether it's just a wheat beer or it's like a Belgian that I've added some wheat to, I can almost guarantee that I'm going to need a blow-off tube in the fermenter. Does that have something to do with what we're talking about in foaming and head retention and such?
Yeah, the foam that's produced in fermentation, at the fermentation you have a big layer of stuff on top. Part of it's krausen, it's stuff that's been pushed up by the yeast and stuff, but part of it is foam. It's the same chemical makeup as beer foam, and so wheat beers, wheat has a higher level of protein than barley malts generally. And proteins are, at least some proteins are foam positive. So yeah, adding more wheat to a fermentation, as long as you're doing it right and it's, going to produce foam is going to create more foam.
And one last question, and one that we can answer. Chad Warner, who you heard on this show, he was a long shot finalist a couple of years ago. We met in person. Super nice guy. Says Firm Cap S stops foam in the starter, in the kettle, and in the fermenter, but not in the bottle or the glass. Why?
Yeah, this one we can give an answer beyond this complete hand waving. The basic answer to that is that firm cap S isn't present in the finished beer. Firm cap S is dimethyl polysiloxane, if I remember right. And anyway, it basically kills bubbles by just reducing the surface tension. And so in the fermenter, it keeps on getting kicked up by the action of the beer fermenting, and just lowers the amount of bubbles. But during fermentation, the yeast partially scrub it out, and also in commercial beers, it's additionally filtered, and the rest of that comes out. So basically, the amount of it in your beer drops below a level that it does anything. It's funny, or not funny, but interesting, let's say, the manufacturers of it actually claim that it helps your beer foam in the end, because the way it reduces foam in the fermenter, it doesn't reduce the amount of foam positive molecules. It just sort of bursts the bubbles. So it leaves you with all those foam positive things floating in your beer that otherwise sort of would have been soaked up into the foam and left behind. So the manufacturer claims that firm cap S actually kills foam in the fermenter but helps foam in your beer. Interesting.
But that in another excellent question to round out the Twitter questions. And thanks to everybody for responding on such a short notice. I gave them like an hour to come up with questions, and they did good.
Oh, that's a good one. And we learned that it's a dessert topping and a floor wax.
You're showing your age. That's good bass.
That's good bass.
Well, on that note, do you anything else on the agenda? Do you want to quickly mention your pumpkin experiment?
Oh yeah, I can mention that. Yeah, I guess from the what's on the agenda standpoint, the next article in Advanced Brewing, written by Chris Bible, is going to be the collapse of foam. So this first one was sort of the birth and formation and stability of foam, and the next one's going to be on sort of the mechanics of the collapse. And then with regard to pumpkins, yeah, I grew giant pumpkins this year in my garden. Not incredibly successful in that, but I got a couple fairly big ones. And I brewed some pumpkin spiced ale and fermented them inside. Fermented the batch inside 3 different pumpkins. I made 10 gallons, and my biggest pumpkin held 5 gallons of wort with a gallon at least of headspace.
Wow.
Yeah, and then 2 other smaller ones held 3 and 2 gallons of wort respectively. Fermented them. The biggest problem I ran into was one that I just totally was completely unexpected. The pumpkins, before I used them, were sitting outside, and it was, December when I brewed it. So they were, here in Texas, that means, between 40 and 50 degrees. So the pumpkins were fairly cold.
Mm.
And when I poured the wort into them, the wort was sort of at fermentation temperature, but the fermentation was really slow to kick off. And I wondered why that was, and I happened to I'd stuck a couple of pumpkins in my fermentation chamber, and I just reached in and touched the outside of them, and I felt, oh, they're cold.
Mm.
And there's these pumpkins weighed. The biggest one was 64 pounds before I scooped the insides out, and that, I maybe scooped out 10 pounds of, seeds and guts. But so there was at least 40 or 50 pounds of, pumpkin material at, between 40 and 50, and that was, interacting with a roughly equal weight of wort, in that case at 60, and so that was interesting. Next time I'll have to acclimatize the pumpkin to fermentation temperature before I try it again.
Or do a lager.
Or do a lager in them. I made them before I headed up to Sioux Falls for for Christmas, and fermented them for 4 or 5 days. They finally did get going on the second day, and then I racked them over to a fermenter before I left because I figured, the pumpkins will disintegrate in the meantime, and I just left the empty pumpkins sitting out on my porch, and I came back and they're fine.
Huh.
They're still sitting there. They're you can tell a little bit around the places where they've been cut open. They're starting to degrade a little bit, but certainly they would still be holding beer if I'd left them in there.
That's cool. Well, I hope that you'll do blog postings and maybe an article in BYO and give us all the details.
Yeah, there's pictures of this on my blog right now of the pumpkins being cut open and the beer fermenting in there. I've also got some of what the inside of the fermenters looked like afterwards that maybe I'll throw up on the blog. It's kind of funny.
So to speak.
So to speak, yeah. Yeah, it doesn't look as good as you might hope.
All right, Chris. Well, I appreciate it. Have a Happy New Year, and we'll talk to you next time.
Okay. Bye, James.
As usual, thanks to Chris Colby. If you want to get a free issue of Brew Your Own, just click on the banner ad on basicbrewing.com. And if you decide to subscribe after that, you'll be helping to support this podcast. We appreciate everybody who has done that. And I'm excited by the notes from everyone taking part in the collaborative experiment. The results should be very interesting, no matter which method you choose to test out, or which recipe, whether you use Chris's or your own. But Chris's recipe is pretty good. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Our 2010 Brewers Logbooks are now in the house, shipping out to your house. And we've also got our Reinheitsgebot is a 4-letter word shirts on our shop as well. And we're sending those out too. Green is still more popular than Vegas Gold for some reason. Check out our homebrewing DVDs, Introduction to Extract Homebrewing, Stepping into All-Grain, Low-Tech Lagering, and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. And if you go on our site, we've got combo deals to save you a few bucks. And you can also see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Kona Bean 10 tree seeds. So coffee seeds. That'd be cool. And Raising Chickens for Dummies. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we appreciate your support. Don't forget, you can also join the American Homebrewers Association through an associate link on our site again. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.